issue. But the reason I invited you on specifically today was that, well, I was looking at this article that is a recent article in BBC, and it's called "Is 25 the New Cutoff Point for Adulthood?" And in it, the psychologists are saying that maybe we should see adolescence as being something that doesn't end at 18, but ends at 25. And what's your opinion of that?
Well, there's no question that childhood, at least in most Western countries, has been extended. And this started to happen rather recently with the onset of the Industrial Revolution in the late 1800s. That's what ended the apprentice system, which had been around for possibly thousands of years. And that's when also, that's when the mandatory education laws, the first ones, were passed, both in the U.S. and Europe. And, that's when in the U.S., the so-called juvenile justice system was set up, and that's when there were a lot of restrictions, very serious restrictions put on young people and their ability to work. So beginning late 1800s, early 1900s, we put in place a lot of mechanisms that had never existed before in human history that separated young people from adults. See, normally, and this is still true in many countries around the world, normally there isn't really much of a separation between childhood and adulthood. In other words, if you are in a developing country today, you're kind of welcomed into the adult world as soon as you show some adult kinds of capabilities. That might be when you're 10, or it might be when you're 13 or 15, but the point is, somewhere in those years, the early teen years certainly, you start to show a lot of those capabilities. And so it's a very natural thing, and it's, as I said, it's still common around the world for young people to kind of move smoothly into adulthood, be welcomed into it. But these mechanisms that were put in place in some Western countries, they, for the first time in history, separated young people from adults, completely isolated young people from adults, basically clustering them together in schools, whether they were learning anything or not letting them work, not letting them have much meaningful contact with adults. So, what this amounted to, what's happened over the past century, is that we have put more and more restrictions on young people when they've gotten into trouble, you see, which has happened because they're isolated from adults. Whenever they've gotten into trouble, we put more restrictions on them. And I document this in my recent book, which is called TEEN 2.0, which people can learn about at TEEN2.0.com, TEEN2.0.com. And so we put more and more restrictions on them. As we put more restrictions on young people and isolated them even more from adults, they've gotten into more trouble. And more and more of them have gotten angry, more and more of them have gotten depressed. In the United States, this has played out horribly, so that now, suicide is the third leading cause of death among teens, for example. It's really played out horribly in our country. About half of the teens in our country under 18 are diagnosable with some form of mental illness, half of them. And there's a lot of conflict between young people and adults, between young people and their parents. And that's all new historically. It's very, very new. So, this is it's a big issue. It's a big, important issue that I've been doing research on for a long time, and still doing research on it. And it's kind of a shame. We're the way what we've done, and at least in some countries, to our families. We really torn our families apart in some sense.
So you're saying it's somewhat of if a person feels like they need to break out and expand their horizons and so forth, but yet they're told that they're too young, that this is not something they should do, then this creates depression, anxiety, the feeling like you're some sort of bird trapped in a cage, and therefore you're going to be fluttering around and not really expanding the way that biology or psychology intended you to do?
Well, yes, of course, evolution made you extremely capable, just shortly after you hit puberty, for obvious reasons, because that's when all the mammalian species, that's when they bear their young. So we're extremely capable shortly after puberty, and I document that in my book, looking at all kinds of cognitive abilities, learning abilities, and amazing abilities that teens have, which begin to deteriorate, believe it or not. Actually, most of our abilities are at their peak, including intelligence, including raw scores on intelligence tests. They're at their peak usually between ages 13 and 15, and many of those abilities just start to decline fairly soon after that, and they just decline throughout life. So, yes, the point is if you take young people who in fact feel like they're adults, feel like they're ready for adulthood, and you say no, you can't, no, you're not fully formed, you're defective, you're whatever it is, you have a defective brain, which is the new mantra, you're something wrong with your brain, which is nonsense. Then yes, many of them, not all of them, but many of them get depressed. Many of them become very hostile, very combative, and because I mean, think about it. That's what happened to you if you were being held back for literally years of your life. So some of them can handle it, but many of them cannot. And so what we've done is we've extended childhood, and I document this in the book quite thoroughly, showing step by step how we gradually made it harder and harder to enter adulthood, and in fact we've increased the age that you have to be before we will let you fully function as an adult. Obviously, there are all kinds of legal restrictions that prevent you from functioning as an adult, at least until you're 18, or in many countries, 21. But there are more subtle barriers that we've erected over the years. And what it's done is it's increased psychopathology among young people, as one should expect. It's exactly what one should expect.
Okay. Well, I think you mentioned something about there's benchmarks that if you look in 1960, which from a human development standpoint, socioculturally is a blip on the radar screen. But since 1960, there seems to have been an incredible change. I like that term, 30 is now the new 20. And the difference between what a 20, 25, and 30-year-old was doing in 1960 as opposed to now 2013.
Well, of course, yes. First of all, in Western countries, people married a lot younger. If you just go back in time 50 years, if you go back 100 years, you find they married even younger. And it was very common, it's still common in many countries around the world, in developing nations certainly, for females to be married in their early or mid-teens. That's very common. No harm done whatsoever, as far as anyone has ever been able to tell. For the males to be a bit older, because they're normally families are counting on them for economic support. But yes, indeed, the people are now marrying later and later and later. So that's one huge difference. And the reason why this new cutoff year of 25, this cutoff age of 25, is being discussed is because now in some Western countries, including the UK and the US, the median age of marriage, the first marriage, is now in the late 20s. And marriage is a kind of surefire indicator that you're supposed to function as an adult. You may not be very mature, but I mean that's an indicator that you've entered adulthood. That's one clear indicator. And the fact that people are marrying so late now suggests to some people that again that childhood is being extended longer. But this is a bad thing. This is what I show in the book, as my research has taught me over the years. It's a terrible thing. The fact that this is actually happening is terrible, and then the fact that we want to kind of go along with it instead of fighting this trend, instead of reversing the trend. We say, oh yes, well the new age for entry into adulthood is, and we go 18, we go 21, we go 23, we go 25. So we'll hit 30 soon, I'm sure.
Well, if we look at popular culture, I mean, one of the things that kind of comes to my mind is a TV show. My wife loved it. I wasn't into it, but the TV show Friends, in which you have a cast that were, in real life pushing 40, but were still acting as if they were, still living that college lifestyle,
Sure.
all the insecurities and stuff. And this is promoted in much of our media, in which we have lots of people who are in their 30s, but they're acting as if they're 21.
Well, yes, this is promoted, and I have a lot of material in the book. Again, that's TEEN2.0. The website is TEEN2.0.com. A lot of material in the book. It's quite a long book. Lots and lots of endnotes, where I talk about the industries that promote what I call the artificial extension of childhood, and they're big industries. First of all, there's an obvious one, which is the illegal drug industry, and it is an industry. It's a very big industry. And that industry preys on young people, usually because responsible adults lose interest in illegal drugs. Usually they do. But then we have also the legal drug industry. They're the biggest villains of all in the United States in promoting this prolongation of childhood because they make billions of dollars uh, off of this because they want young people to be in turmoil because when they're in turmoil, they're put on medication, and that's become one of the biggest markets for our pharmaceutical companies. And in fact, the rate at which, just even in the past 10 to 15 years, the rate at which psychoactive drugs is being given to our teens has just skyrocketed. We actually passed a milestone just a few years ago. Now more money is being spent on psychoactive drugs for teens than on all other pharmaceuticals combined for teens. In other words, that includes acne medication, that includes antibiotics. So a very, very dramatic increase in that market. So, and then you've got the media. Of course, the fashion and the music industries, they make a fortune off of this so-called teen culture, and they promote it, and they do try to expand that market. And if you can add a few years onto it, you make a lot more money. Now, why is that? Why do you make so much money off of that particular group? I mean, why not just let them become adults? You make some money there too. Well, there's a difference because you see, when we're not quite adults, by definition, we don't have much in the way of responsibility, and that you see is the marketer's fantasy, the marketer's wet dream, so to speak. In the United States, teens spend about $10 billion a year frivolously. See, that's what marketers pray for, because that means that they can introduce a new video game or a new kind of dress or a new kind of hairspray or anything, and they can attach it to an image of a young attractive celebrity, and overnight they can generate millions of dollars in sales because see, all of that spending by our teens is discretionary. Now, they can spend it on anything they want, and once they become adults, they can't. They're very constrained. So there are big advertising and marketing firms in the U.S. That just do nothing. They do nothing but scheme day and night about how to impact that market. So yes, it's promoted. That so-called stage of life is promoted. And I should point out that so-called stage of life didn't exist through most of human history, still does not exist in more than 100 cultures around the world. More than 100 cultures around the world, according to anthropological research, there's not even a term for adolescence.
Well, we take a look at just an example of how weird this is, and that would be the fact that we're telling well, an example. A lot of times, if an 18-year-old were to announce that she was getting married, the immediate reaction is, well, don't you think you're too young? Don't you think you need to get more experience and live life? But at the same time, we would trust her if she signs up for the U.S. Air Force and is flying a multi-million-dollar airplane and, I don't know, dropping bombs somewhere in Afghanistan or something. So it seems like a kind of a weird aspect of responsibility that you'd be trusted to be able to put your life in danger and to be using equipment that is some of the most advanced in the world. But yet, if you want to put a wedding ring on and start a family, then you're not mature enough. You need to wait.
Well, sure. It was that kind of discrepancy, you could say, that led to the lowering of the voting age in the United States back in the 1970s. We were still involved in the Vietnam War, and we were sending hundreds of thousands of very young people, mainly young men, off to war to carry weapons and to kill or be killed. But we wouldn't let them vote. And in fact, in most states, we wouldn't even let them smoke cigarettes legally. So because of that, it was because we had so many young people in the military that there was a concerted movement to lower the voting age to 18. But we still have these discrepancies. I mean, the biggest one right now that people are arguing about is alcohol. Because again, we'll send them off to war in Afghanistan and maybe at some point Syria or wherever it may be. We'll send them off to war, but we won't let them drink alcohol. And again, in some states, they can't even buy cigarettes and so on. So there are these discrepancies, and young people are very sensitive to this. They know about these things. And that's why we see so much behavior that we think of, or not me, but I mean that generally society thinks of as rebellious and irresponsible. These so-called rebellious and irresponsible things that young people do are just adult behaviors. In other words, if they have sex when they're very young, they're doing something adults do. If they go on a drinking binge, you see, even though it's illegal for them to drink, they're just doing something adults do. If they take drugs, they're doing something adults do. So these things we think of as extremely irresponsible and rebellious, those are just young people trying desperately, and sometimes inappropriately, they're trying to enter the adult world, but we won't let them. In fact, we just slap them down when they break all these rules we have. One of the studies I did looked at how many rules young people are actually subjected to, and in the U.S., they're subjected to about 10 times as many rules and laws as mainstream adults, roughly to twice as many rules as active duty U.S. Marines, believe it or not, and roughly to twice as many rules as incarcerated felons. So they're not imagining it. They are not imagining it. They really are subjected to incredible number of restrictions, which are appropriate for young children, you see, young children, but not really appropriate for young adults.
So you're saying then that almost every society on Earth, and maybe even all of them originally, had some sort of rite of passage, whether that was a vision quest or something like that. It was a rite of passage. And since our society has gotten rid of those things and then extended childhood, then instead of doing the more mature activity to become adults and to show their adulthood, they're left with no other choice but to do the things that are actually somewhat destructive in order to assert their adulthood.
Well, we think of them as destructive, but they often don't think of them that way at all. They're just creating their own version of adult society. A simple example of that are gangs, youth gangs. Youth gangs are armies. They're real armies. I mean, they have codes of honor, and they have ranks and so on. They're just trying to get into the adult world, and very often the leaders in these gangs or the real agitators, the real troublemakers among young people are people who really are the most desperate to enter the adult world. And if you let them enter the adult world, they would be probably among the most talented adults that you'd ever find, because that's what they are. They're precocious. You see, they're ahead of their time in a sense. They're precocious. Let me mention, because I know we're a little short on time, a couple of websites that are relevant here. I've mentioned TEEN2.0.com, which is about my recent book on the topic, but I also have some very good tests out there now. One of them is a test of maturity, which is at howadultareyou.com. That's howadultareyou.com. And we're working on a new study based on people who've taken that, more than 75,000 people over a wide age range, and it's very, very, very interesting outcome here, because what we find is that first of all, adults believe that teens will score very poorly on this. Adults believe that teens will score about 48%. Because this is just it's a test of very kind of basic adult capabilities. It's a test of adultness, as we say, and adults will score on the average around 90%, which makes sense. They should score high, but in fact, teens don't score 48%. They score on average about 88%, and of course, a lot of the teens outscore a lot of the adults. So there's a lot of variability, and this brings up the whole issue of individuality. See, we assume that all young people, all teens under a certain age, are equally incompetent and irresponsible. And when you actually go ahead and do this kind of research, you're reminded of what really is obvious, that they're all extremely different. And we know from this research that about 30% of the teens who've taken this test, that's under 18, actually outscore the median adult, meaning they outscore half of the adults in the United States. That's millions of teens under 18, that's ages 13 to 17, who are more adult, you see, across a very wide range of adult abilities. They're more adult than most adults. And we still don't give them any way to enter adulthood. It's really a tragedy. So howadultareyou.com is one place people can go. And then there's a very good test of infantilization. Infantilization, of course, is this phenomenon I've been talking about, where you treat people who are no longer children, you treat them as children. That's called infantilization. And there's another test, howinfantilizedareyou.com, where you get a measure. It actually shows you on a scale, how infantilized you are versus other people, versus children, versus soldiers, and so on and so forth. So howinfantilizedareyou.com, and then there's a new website that's called extendedchildhooddisorder.com, and that's a new diagnostic category I've been developing, because I think a lot of the problems of young people, a lot of the pathology, the psychopathologies that we see, those really come from being isolated from adults and being infantilized. And this extended childhood disorder is what I'm calling the result of that. If basically the culture won't let you enter adulthood and traps you with a lot of your mindless peers all the time, again, you might end up extremely depressed or extremely angry. And so extendedchildhooddisorder.com, it's a website where you kind of get a kind of diagnosis of that condition. And there are others as well. I have a brand new test online that's at TEENParentingSkills.com. It's a very long test. Unfortunately, it's probably too long, but it might be one of the best tests I've ever developed, because if you're a parent of teens and you take this test, you'll learn a lot. You'll learn a lot from taking the test, and your scores will reflect, at least as I see the world, they'll reflect how good a parent of teens you actually are. And of course, if you are holding them back, if you are infantilizing them, for example, you'll probably get a low score on the test. So it's very interesting. It's very interesting test. It really basically maps out a way to parent teens so that they really do flourish, and so that you're not in conflict with them, and so that they do not fall into the abyss of teen turmoil.
Mm-hmm. Those sound really interesting, but I'm going to take a few since I've got a 13-year-old at home. So I definitely want to get some insights on that. Well, thank you very much for sharing this, and I really, really, really encourage listeners to check out your website and check out some of these tests. I think you'll learn a lot by doing this. Again, thank you, Dr. Epstein.
Sure, thank you very much. I want to mention the main website is simply drrobertepstein.com. So there's all different ways to get to my materials, but that is the main one, drrobertepstein.com, or even just drepstein.com. But thank you so much, Michael. It was a very interesting exchange. I enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. Bye now.